Hey guys, in this video we're going to follow up on our series for translucency effects for the character, and we're going to create this Stealthboy effect. So let's go ahead and get started. Alright, let's start with a copy of our character blueprint, and we'll also get a copy of our depth culling material from the previous video. And let's rename it. I'll just call it M_Stealthboy. And we also remember from that video that we need to go to our character and run them on the custom depth pass. And we also need to turn on the surface translucency volume for them. So I'll just type in shadow, and it'll be right here, volumetric translucency. And let's go ahead and open up our Stealthboy material. Okay, and we'll come over here, and we're going to change the opacity mask clip value to 0.000001. And then we're going to scroll all the way down, and we're going to go to the translucency shadows. And I'm just going to put the first one back to default for now. Now we're going to revisit the shadows later, but we'll leave it like this for now. And then we're going to come over and we're going to create a new material layer, and we'll plug that into the depth culling layer. So let's go back to the content browser. Now let's come over here and we'll do materials and textures, and we'll make a new material function, and I'll call it mf_stealthboy. And let's go ahead and open it up. Okay, I'll start by bringing in a lerp, and I need two constants, and I'll set the first one to a value of 1, and I'll plug that into A, and the second one a value of 0.925, and I'll plug that into B, and then I need an input, and I'll call this one refraction in, and I'll put it to a single scalar. And I'll go ahead and collapse it down and plug it into the alpha, and I'll plug this into the output, and let's call the output refraction out, and then let's copy and paste the whole thing, and we'll change this value to 0, and we'll change the input to opacity in, and the output to opacity out. And let's go ahead and save that, and we'll go back to the material. Okay, let's hook up the function first, and then we'll talk about how it works. So it was called mf_stealthboy, and we'll do opacity to opacity, and we can get rid of this placeholder. And then we'll do refraction to refraction, and then we'll need a parameter, and we'll call this value. And we'll plug this into both, and then we'll come out of this opacity and we'll do a lerp, and we'll set the second value to 0, and then we'll do another parameter, and we'll call this mask, and we'll plug that into the alpha, and then we'll take this output and plug it into the final opacity. Okay, now let's go back and see how it works. Okay, we'll start with this parameter over here. Now these are going to be driven by timelines on the dynamic material instances, and we'll get to those in just a little bit. But this one's going to drive a float into this function here that we just created. So let's go ahead and open it up. And so that float value is going to come into each one of these inputs, and this one is going to drive the opacity. So it's going to lerp from fully opaque to fully transparent, and at the same time it's also going to lerp the refraction from no refraction to a refraction of 0.925. So as the material fades out, the refraction is going to fade in, and then we'll go back to the material, and then the refraction is going to go straight to the material output because we don't need to do anything else to it, but the opacity is going to have to pass through the depth culling layer. So let's go ahead and open that up, and you should recognize this from the previous videos. This determines which pixel is behind another pixel, and then it'll mask it out. So while this determines what is visible, the new opacity that we're driving in will determine how visible it should be. And so back on the material, it's going to plug into this lerp, which is hooked up to the parameter, and again this is driven by a timeline, and it's going to determine when the pixel is visible. So at one end of the timeline, it's going to receive its opacity from these two functions, and at the other end of the timeline, it's going to receive an opacity of 0. And then that's going to come out and be the final opacity for the material. Okay, let's go back to the content browser. Okay, let's go ahead and create our material instances. I'll call this one mi_stealthboy. And let's go ahead and open it up. And we'll activate the mask and value parameters. And we'll save and close this. And then let's go ahead and duplicate it, and we'll create one for the logo. And then let's go ahead and open it up. And we'll activate the plastic override, and we'll set it to true. And we'll activate the normal map, and we'll select the logo. And then let's go ahead and save and close this. Okay, and let's go ahead and apply them just to see what they look like. And then we'll put the body on. And if we notice, we saw a slight drop in quality of the shadows and of its color detail. Now to see why that's happening, let's go back to the material. And we'll come down over here to the lighting mode. And if you remember from a previous video, we chose surface translucency volume. Now what this is really for is when you have translucent materials and you want to give them sort of opaque qualities. And that's why we chose it, because we needed access to these material attributes over here. But now it's kind of giving us some issues. So we could try to use the forward shader, which is a more accurate version of it, but it's also a lot more expensive. So we don't want to do that. So what we're going to do is approach this a different way. Now, we don't have to worry too much about the loss in color detail, because we already solved that here. As the material fades out, it's going to hide the fact that we're losing that detail. But we still need to deal with the shadows. So for that, let's go back to the content browser. And what we're going to do is we're going to create our own shadows using a material. So first we'll create the material function for it. We'll choose material function, and I'll call it mf_shadow. And let's go ahead and open it up. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to create a function where our shadow will fade out in the same way that our character is fading out. So for example, if our character was fading out from top to bottom, then we might want to create something like a panner. But since the Stealthboy is a really simple effect, then the shadow fade will be really simple too. So we'll just bring in an input, and we'll leave it as a 3 vector, and we'll just call it mask in, and we'll collapse this down, and we'll just do a subtract, and then we'll get another input, and we'll change it to a single scalar, and we'll call it value in, and then we'll plug that into the subtract, and then we'll plug this into the output, and we'll name the output mask out. Okay, let's go ahead and save and close this. Okay, and then let's come down and we'll create a new material, and I'll call this m_shadow, and let's go ahead and open it up. Okay, let's come down and we'll choose the blend mode as masked, and we'll change the shading model to unlit, and then let's call in our new function, and it was called shadow, and then let's get a single constant, and we'll convert it to a parameter, and we'll just call this value, and let's go ahead and plug that in, and then we'll get a texture sample, and we'll convert this to a parameter, and we'll just call this texture mask. And just as a placeholder, we'll choose the noise from the starter content. It'll be this checker pattern right here. And then we're going to come in off of the R value. And let's go ahead and preview that real quick. So what we're seeing is it's creating sort of like a pixelation. Now remember, this is just a starter content texture, and we're just using it as a placeholder. Ideally, you're going to want to bring in your own texture mask with a much more smooth grayscale. But this will work for now. We'll come out of the UVs and we'll do a texture coordinate. And I'm just going to ramp mine up to 5 for now. And then we can stop previewing this, and we'll plug this into opacity mask. And then let's go ahead and save that. And let's go back to the content browser. Okay, let's come down here and make a material instance from it, and I'll call it mi_shadow. And let's go ahead and open it up. Okay, let's activate the value parameter. We don't need to activate the texture mask because we're going to keep it for now. But let's bring this over, and just real quick, we'll apply this to both elements. and then we'll test out the value parameter. This is how we're going to control the shadow, by raising and lowering this value. Okay, let's put that back to 0, and then we'll save and close this, and then we can come over here and put these back to default. And since we're going to be using shadows from the material, we don't need them on the character anymore, so we can go ahead and remove them. First we'll remove the volumetric translucency, and then we'll remove it from the character altogether. And then let's go back to the Stealthboy material, and we'll put this back down to 0, and let's go ahead and save and compile that. And then we'll go back to the content browser. Okay, let's go ahead and open up our character blueprint. And before we jump into the dynamic material instances, we're going to need a way to utilize all of the different materials we made. So for that, we're going to need to create more character meshes. So let's go to the viewport, and we'll duplicate the mesh 3 times. And we're going to refer to the first mesh as the opaque mesh, the second mesh as the translucency mesh, and the third mesh as the shadow mesh, and then the fourth mesh as the overlay mesh. So I'll go ahead and rename those real quick. And just real quick, the Stealthboy doesn't use an overlay material, so this mesh is going to be left blank, but when we get to an effect that does use it, we'll show how to do it in both Unreal 5 and Unreal 4, because Unreal 5 has a built-in overlay mesh. Now we'll select the 3 new ones that we just made, and we'll turn their animation class to none, and we can see that they're stuck in the T pose. So let's go to the construction script, and we'll start with the first one, the translucency mesh, and we'll say set master pose, and then we'll bring in the opaque mesh, and we'll use that as the new master bone component, and we'll hook that up. And then let's copy and paste this and do it for each of the other 2. And then we'll hook all 3 of them up. And let's go back to the viewport, and we'll compile and save. And so now our 3 meshes are matched to the main mesh. Now let's select all 4 of them, and we'll come over to the details panel, and we'll search for ANIM, which is short for animation. And we want to go down to visibility based animation, and we want to make sure that they're all set to always tick pose and refresh bones. Okay, now let's just select the 3 new ones, and we'll search for collision. And we just want to make sure that the collision preset is set to no collision. And then we'll search for LOD, which is level of detail. And under force LOD, we're just going to set it to level 1. And that's because we want to keep the outline the same, but we don't need the subdivision across their surface because they're going to mostly be invisible. Now we'll go to the first mesh, and we're going to set some individual settings for each one. Okay, we'll start with the opaque mesh, and we're going to check for depth, and we don't need him to be rendered on the custom depth pass. We'll check the translucency, and we do want him to be rendered on the custom depth pass. We can turn it off for shadow, and we can turn it off for overlay. Now we'll go back to the top, and we're going to search for shadow, and the opaque character does not need to cast any shadows. The translucency one doesn't need to. The shadow mesh, he will cast shadows. We want to make sure that it's not volumetric, and we're going to click hidden shadow because we're going to turn him invisible, but we still want him to cast the shadow. And for overlay, we'll turn it off as well. Then we'll go back to the top, and we'll check for visibility, and we're going to leave that one on. And then for translucency, we'll turn it off, but it'll turn on and off during the effect itself. The shadow one will just be off the entire time, as well as for the overlay one. Okay, let's go ahead and compile and save, and we'll go to the event graph. Okay, and now we're ready to create our dynamic material instances, and we'll do that off of event begin play. So I'll come off of here and I'll type create dynamic, and I'll choose this first one, and for the parent I'll choose mi_stealthboy, and then I'll promote this to a variable, and I'll call this first variable dmi_0, and then we'll do another one for his logo, and I'll change this to the logo, and then I'll promote that to a variable, and I'll call this one DMI_1, and then we want to assign both of these to the translucency mesh, so we'll bring that in, and we'll say set material, and for element 0, I'll use DMI0, and then I'll do the same thing for element 1. And now we want to do the same thing for the shadow mesh. So we'll start by creating another dynamic material. And for the parent, we'll call DMI shadow. And we'll promote this to a variable. And we'll call this one DMI_2. And I only need to create one, and I can apply it to both elements 0 and 1 because he's going to be invisible. So we'll bring in the shadow mesh, and we'll say set material. Okay, now that we have our dynamic material instances, we can access those parameters during gameplay. So let's go ahead and create the function to do that. Okay, let's start with a custom event, and I'll just name mine Stealthboy On Off, and we'll start with a sequence node, and we'll give it 3 pins, and we'll start with the last one, and we'll do a flip-flop, and this will be when the player is pressing the on or off button, and out of the on position, we'll do set visibility, and we'll choose the mesh. Now, I don't want the opaque mesh, I'm going to do the translucency mesh, so I'll replace that real quick, and I'll put this as the target, and we want to set the new visibility to true, and then out of here we're going to do a timeline, and for this timeline I'll just name it mask, and we'll use the same name of the parameter so we can keep track of it. Now let's go ahead and open this timeline up, and we'll add a new float track, and we'll call it mask, and then we'll do a duration of 0.25, and we'll add a new keyframe, and we'll start the time at 0, and we'll give it a value of 1, and then we'll add a new keyframe, and we'll go to the end of the timeline for time 0.25, and we'll give it a value of 0, and let's go ahead and bring that into view, and then let's go ahead and go back to the event graph. Okay, and then we're going to come out of the update pin, and we want to update the parameters on our material instances. So we'll start with DMI0, and we'll say set scalar parameter, and we want to update the one that we named mask, and we'll update it with this float right here. And then we also need to do the same thing for the logo. And then when the timeline is finished, we'll do a branch. And we need to know if it was finished going forward or backward, so we'll go equal, and then we'll plug this in. So if it was going backwards, that means that the timeline was reversing, and that means that we're turning the Stealthboy off. So all we're going to do is just go set visibility, and again we need to replace this with the translucency mesh, and we'll just set the new visibility to off. Now if it was going forward, that means that we're continuing to turn the Stealthboy on. So at this point we're going to set the visibility of the opaque mesh to off. So we'll copy this, and if that's the case, then we need to start the next timeline, and we'll call this one timeline value, and let's go ahead and open it up. Okay, we'll set the duration to 1 second, and we'll add a new float track, and we'll call it value 1, and then we'll add a new keyframe, and we'll go to time 0 and a value of 0. Then we'll add another keyframe, and we'll go to a time of 1 second and a value of 1, and then let's go ahead and bring that into view. And then we'll add another float track, and we'll call this value 2, and let's come down here, and we'll add a new keyframe, and it'll be at a time of 0 and a value of 0. And then we'll add another keyframe, and it'll be at a time of 1, and we'll give it a value of 0.15. And then let's go ahead and go back to the event graph. Okay, and we're going to come out of the update pin again. So let's grab DMI 0, and we'll say set scalar parameter. And this time we want to set the parameter that we named value, and we'll do it with value 1. And then we also want to do that for the logo. So we'll copy and paste this, and we'll do it with DMI 1. And then at the same time as this, we want to update the value for the shadow. So we'll grab DMI 2, and we'll just copy and paste this again. And then we'll update this with value 2. Okay, now after the timeline is finished, we need to know what direction it was going again. So we'll do the same thing, branch, and we'll come out of direction and we'll do an equals. And this time we're going to select backwards. And the reason why is if it was going forward, this is the end of the timeline, and that means that the Stealthboy is completely turned on, so we don't have to do anything. We're only concerned if it's going backwards, which means that we're in the middle of turning it off. And if that's true, then we're going to set the visibility of the opaque mesh back on. And then we're going to hook all the way around, and we're going to reverse the mask timeline. And let's clean that up real quick. Okay, now let's go back to the beginning. Now again, if we were turning it off, that means that we want to come all the way over and start the value timeline from the reverse. And we'll bring this down. And we'll go back to the sequence pins. And what we want to do is when the player first touches the on-off button, we want to stop all the timelines, because they're either going to play forward or reverse from their current position. Okay, now let's go back and we'll hook this up to an event that we can activate. Okay, and I just hooked my function up to a generic dispatcher that I use off of my player controller. It's just bound to the Q key, and we'll go ahead and put that bind into event begin play. Now later you can hook it up to like an actual inventory item or a character skill, but we'll start with this for now. And now let's go through and we're going to take a look at some of the key points of the function that we just created. Alright, and the first thing we'll look at is the sequence node at the beginning of the function, and what that does is it stops all the timelines, and that's again because they're going to play and reverse from their current position. So if we go back to the game real quick, and we'll hit play, and we can see that if we start and stop it repeatedly, it'll keep its correct position, and it won't jump or skip to the beginning or end. Okay, let's go back to the function. And the next thing we want to take a look at is the timeline for the mask parameter. And again, we'll go back and see that on the material. And the mask parameter is right here, and it's helping to blend between the opaque and translucent material. And the reason why we need to do that blend is because this translucent material is using surface translucency volume. And so what it's doing is it's faking its opacity, but that fake isn't accurate enough to not be detected during the switch. So let's go back to the function real quick, and we can see where the timeline is updating the translucent material as it fades in and blends over the opaque material. And then when it's finished, it'll set the opaque material to invisible. But just real quick, let's unhook this, and then we can see what it looks like without the blend. And when we look at it in game, we'll be able to see right when it changes from the opaque to the translucent material. You can see it popping right there. Now let's go back and hook it up. And now we'll be able to see a much smoother blend between the two. instead of it just popping from one to the other. Okay, let's go back to the function. And after it's done with the timeline for the mask parameter, it goes to the timeline for the value parameter, and that's this parameter right here on the material. And remember, this one controls that when the opacity fades out, the refraction fades in. So let's go ahead and take a look at that in game. Okay, his opacity and refraction values seem to be working good, so let's go back to the function. And also remember that the shadow material is also updating off of this timeline. And then this is the end of the function, so if you were turning the Stealthboy on, the function is complete. If you were turning it off, it knows to hook back around and reverse itself starting at the timeline for the mask parameter. Alright, we're all finished setting up our Stealthboy effect. And in this video we had a lot to cover. We had the 3 new character meshes, we did the dynamic material instances, and we did the timelines to control the parameters. And that's why we chose the Stealthboy. It's a relatively simple material effect. But in the next video we'll check out a different cloaking device that's a little more complicated, and it'll have some more interesting visuals that we can plug in on top of this one. But in the meantime, I hope this helped. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in another video.